A man in a white laboratory coat at a workbench in Manchester, England in the year 1956 lowered a diamond cutting saw onto a roll of pure copper that was older than the New Testament. The roll was so brittle that the air alone was breaking it. The copper was crumbling into dust faster than they could photograph it. The decision had finally been made. The only way to read what was written on the inside of the metal was to slice the entire roll into wafer-thin strips and read the cut surfaces. So the man with the saw began to cut, and what fell away from the saw blade as the first strip dropped onto the workbench was a list written in a strange hybrid of ancient Hebrew letter forms mixed with embedded Greek letters that scholars to this day cannot explain. A list of 64 hiding places. A list of buried treasure totaling more than 200 tons of pure gold and silver. A list of vessels of tribute and consecrated items that some of the scholars in the room believed had been removed from the Second Temple of Jerusalem before the Romans destroyed it in the year 70 of the Christian era. A list that, according to one reading of the entries, may have included the Ark of the Covenant. This is not myth. This is not legend. This is the Copper Scroll, catalog number 3Q15. It was discovered in 1952 in a limestone cave on the western shore of the Dead Sea, above the ruins of the Essene settlement at Qumran. It is one of the most controversial documents ever recovered from the ancient world, and the entire human race had to wait 3 years for them to figure out how to read it, because the document was not parchment, it was not papyrus, it was made of solid copper, and the script that the scribes who buried it had carved into the metal is, even today, partially undeciphered. Subscribe to the Buried Testament right now. The treasures the priests of Jerusalem hid before the city burned are being unearthed on this channel week by week. What you are about to walk through is one of the strangest and most consequential archaeological documents in human history, and the implications of what is written on those copper plates for the location of the most sacred object in the entire ancient Hebrew tradition are larger than most modern Christians have ever been told. Subscribe so you do not miss what surfaces next. A Bedouin shepherd boy in 1947 had chased a lost goat into a Dead Sea cliff, thrown a stone, and shattered the pottery that gave the world the Dead Sea Scrolls. 5 years later, in March of 1952, a Bedouin team working with archaeologist Henri de Contenson crawled into a third cave 2 kilometers north of the main Qumran settlement. The cave was an Essene hiding place, sealed clay jars, parchment fragments, the standard signature. But at the back of the cave, in a low alcove where the limestone ceiling almost met the floor, they found something no archaeologist had ever pulled out of a Qumran cave. They found 2 long sheets of pure copper. The sheets were rolled together. They had been hammered impossibly thin. They were covered, on the inside surface, in tightly carved lines of what appeared to be ancient Hebrew letter forms. The metal was so degraded after 2,000 years that the copper had turned almost entirely to copper oxide. The roll was rigid. It would crumble if anyone tried to unroll it by force. Nobody in the history of Dead Sea Scrolls discovery had ever found a manuscript made of metal. The archaeologists cataloged the find as 3Q15, meaning the 15th document from Cave 3 of Qumran. They sealed it in a humidity-controlled case. They shipped it to Jerusalem, and then nobody could figure out how to read it. The solution came from England. Wright Baker, professor of mechanical engineering at the Manchester College of Technology, proposed an unprecedented technique. The copper roll would be sliced into thin strips along its long axis, like cutting a tree branch into wafers along its length. The cut surfaces would then reveal the writing on the curved interior of the original roll. Yes, the scroll would be destroyed in the process, but the inside of the metal would finally become readable. The decision to proceed was made in 1955. Wright Baker received the scroll in Manchester. Working alongside him as the academic supervisor was a young Oxford-trained Dead Sea Scrolls scholar named John Allegro, who was part of the official international editorial team for the Qumran manuscripts. Wright Baker mapped the curve of the roll, glued a thin adhesive backing onto the copper to hold the strips together, and in 1956, lowered the diamond saw. The diamond saw moved through the ancient metal with the gentleness of a watchmaker. Each strip was lifted off and laid flat on a clean workbench. As each strip came free, the carved letter forms on the interior surface of the original roll became readable for the first time in 1900 years. 23 strips fell off the saw in total. 23 thin slices of copper carved by an unknown scribe before the Romans came. What John Allegro read on those strips, line by line as each one came clear, changed his entire understanding of what the Essenes had been doing at Qumran. The text was not religious. The text was not philosophical. The text was not a scriptural commentary or a hymn or a community rule like the other Dead Sea Scrolls. The text was an inventory, 64 entries. Each entry listed a specific location somewhere in the ancient land of Judea. Each entry described what was hidden at that location. Each entry gave the precise quantity, and each entry was written in a peculiar technical Hebrew administrative dialect that scholars later realized was the kind of bureaucratic shorthand used by temple priests when accounting for the contents of the Jerusalem treasury. The contents being inventoried were staggering. Talents of pure silver buried in a cistern under a courtyard. Talents of gold sealed inside a tomb on a specific hillside. Vessels of consecrated tribute hidden in the conduit of a wadi. Bars of refined silver placed in a niche behind a specific waterfall. Sacred vessels deposited in the third stone of a specific staircase descending into a specific tomb. When all 64 entries were finally tallied, the inventory amounted to approximately 4,630 talents of gold and silver. A single talent in the ancient Hebrew system was roughly 75 pounds of metal. The total inventory described over 200 tons of pure precious metal. 200 tons. John Allegro read this number and concluded the only thing a rational scholar could conclude. The copper scroll was an inventory of the treasure of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. The treasure had been removed from the temple in roughly 67 or 68 of the Common Era, when the Roman general Vespasian and his son Titus were advancing on Judea to crush the Jewish revolt. The priests of the temple had emptied their vaults. They had distributed the contents to trusted custodians. They had buried it across the entire territory of Judea in dozens of hiding places, and the Essenes at Qumran had been entrusted with the master inventory. The copper scroll was the index card. The Romans burned the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. They sacked the temple. They took whatever they could find. The famous spoils later commemorated on the Arch of Titus still standing in Rome today. But they never found the deeper vault, because the deeper vault was already buried in 64 separate hidden locations, and the only document that listed those locations was carved into a copper scroll that was sealed inside a clay jar in Cave 3 of Qumran for 1900 years, before John Allegro and Wright Baker pulled it open with a diamond saw. Allegro published this conclusion in his 1960 book on the copper scroll. One competing scholar dismissed the entire thesis as Jewish folklore. He argued the treasure totals were fictional, the kind of symbolic legend the Essenes would have copied for religious reasons. He called Allegro naive, the folklore reading lost. Over the following decades, careful work by the Dutch-born scholar Albert Wolters showed that the technical Hebrew dialect of the inventory matches the exact administrative shorthand used by temple priests in real accounting documents from the same period. The locations described were real geographic places in ancient Judea. The format matches authentic temple inventories. Wolters concluded in his 1996 critical edition that the copper scroll is almost certainly an authentic priestly inventory of consecrated temple treasure hidden before the Roman sack. Allegro had been right all along, so we have an actual inventory. We have an actual list of buried places. We have an actual quantity of more than 200 tons of precious metal. But this is not what makes the copper scroll one of the strangest documents ever found. What makes the copper scroll one of the strangest documents ever found is the script itself. The Hebrew on the copper plates is not normal Hebrew. The letter forms are Paleo-Hebrew of an archaic style mixed with Mishnaic Hebrew of a later style, a combination that does not appear anywhere else in the Dead Sea Scrolls library and does not appear in any other ancient Hebrew text known to scholarship. The language is technical administrative dialect that nobody had ever seen in a literary or religious manuscript before. And the most baffling feature of the script is not the Hebrew at all. Scattered throughout the 64 entries are 14 separate clusters of Greek alphabetic letters that have no clear function whatsoever. A normal Hebrew text from this period would not contain Greek letters at all. The Essenes wrote in Hebrew and Aramaic. They knew Greek existed. They preserved a few Greek language scrolls in Cave 4 of Qumran, but they did not embed Greek letters into Hebrew administrative documents. It was not a thing that any other ancient Jewish scribe ever did. Yet here, in the inventory of buried temple treasure, the scribe stops periodically and writes a small cluster of 2 or 3 Greek letters at the end of an entry. Then he goes back to Hebrew. Nobody knows why. There are 2 serious theories. Both are unsettling. The first reading says the Greek letters are coded directional markers. The literal location described in the Hebrew is a decoy. The real hiding place is offset from the Hebrew location by an amount only the Greek letters reveal. A priest delivering the inventory would have to know how to convert the Greek code into actual paces and actual directions. Without the conversion key, the Hebrew alone leads any treasure hunter to the wrong cistern, the wrong tomb, the wrong stone. The second reading is more disturbing. It says the Greek letters indicate that the senior priests of the late Second Temple were operating in two distinct cultural languages at once, Hebrew for the public ritual, Greek for the inner administrative apparatus. In this reading, the copper scroll accidentally preserves evidence that the actual treasury accounts of the temple were being kept in coded Greek, behind the Hebrew religious facade. The Greek letters are not directional. They are the language the actual priesthood spoke when they were counting their own gold. Nobody knows which theory is correct. The Greek letters in the copper scroll are still partially undeciphered. 70 years after Wright Baker first cut the scroll open, scholars are still arguing about what each cluster means. Some entries have their Greek letters reasonably interpreted, others remain a complete mystery. The script nobody recognizes is not a foreign language. The script nobody recognizes is the in-house code of the late Temple priesthood, designed to be readable only by the priests who already knew where the treasure was buried. And then we come to the most explosive question the copper scroll forces us to ask. What exactly was on the list? The standard reading of the 64 entries describes things like talents of silver, talents of gold, vessels of tribute, sacred ointment vials. Most of the entries are quantities of bullion, but scattered through the 64 entries are several specific references that some scholars have read as descriptions of the consecrated furnishings of the temple itself. Entry 7 mentions vessels of tribute and priestly garments hidden under the steps of a specific structure. Entry 21 describes a chest of consecrated offerings sealed inside a specific cave. Entry 47, in a passage that the Dutch-born scholar Albert Wolters considers among the most intriguing of the entire scroll, references a specific structure that contains what the Hebrew calls vessels of the inner sanctum. The inner sanctum of the Second Temple in the Hebrew tradition contained one object above all others, the Ark of the Covenant. The scribe of the copper scroll never writes the word ark. He could not. Anyone reading the plates who was not a temple priest had to be locked out of the most sacred entries. So he wrote vessels of the inner sanctum. And in the entire Hebrew priestly vocabulary of the Second Temple period, the inner sanctum contained one object the phrase ever pointed at by default. The inference is not academic. The inference is forensic, because there is another ancient document accepted as canonical scripture in the apocryphal traditions of the Eastern Church and in some Catholic Bibles that explicitly describes a parallel hiding of temple vessels in advance of foreign destruction. That document is the second book of Maccabees, chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. Second Maccabees chapter 2 describes the actions of the prophet Jeremiah in the years immediately before the Babylonian destruction of the First Temple in the year 586 before the Christian era. According to the text, Jeremiah received a divine warning that the temple was about to be destroyed. He gathered the most sacred vessels of the tabernacle, including the Ark of the Covenant and the altar of incense, and he led them up into the wilderness to the heights of Mount Nebo, the same mountain where Moses had died and where Moses had been buried by the angels. Jeremiah hid the sacred vessels in a cave on Mount Nebo. He sealed the cave entrance. He warned that the location would remain unknown until God himself gathered his people together again. This is a canonical, apocryphal text. It is preserved in the Orthodox and Catholic biblical traditions. It records as historical event the deliberate hiding of the temple vessels, including the Ark, by the prophet Jeremiah before the first temple destruction. Now consider what we have just walked through. We have the copper scroll, a real document hidden in a real cave, listing real hiding places of real temple treasure, hidden in advance of the real Roman destruction of the Second Temple. The structural parallel to 2 Maccabees chapter 2 is exact. The methodology is the same. The kind of object hidden is described in the same administrative language. The parallel demands an answer. The Second Temple priests in the year 68 were following the Jeremiah precedent. They were hiding consecrated vessels of the inner sanctum exactly the way the prophet had hidden the Ark 600 years before, exactly because they had inherited that tradition. The question is no longer whether they did it. The question is what they hid. And here the historical record splits. One ancient tradition says the inner sanctum of the Second Temple was empty after the Babylonian destruction because the original Ark had been lost. Another tradition says a reconstructed Ark stood in the Holy of Holies of the Second Temple. A third tradition says the original Ark was secretly recovered and returned by the priests who came back from Babylonian exile under Ezra. Modern scholarship is divided. The ancient Jewish sources are divided. But the Copper Scroll, whatever it actually means, is an authentic priestly inventory of consecrated items hidden in advance of the destruction. It is the only such document known to exist. It is the only direct evidence we have of the buried temple treasure of Jerusalem, and almost all of the 64 hiding locations on the list are, as of this video, still buried. Drop the word copper in the comments if the copper scroll has rewired what you understood about the temple treasure of Jerusalem, because the story did not end with the cutting in Manchester. Modern expeditions have searched for entries on the list for 70 years. An American-Israeli treasure hunter named Vendel Jones spent decades digging in the wilderness of Judea and came home empty-handed. Other surveys found the named cisterns and tombs already cleaned out. Many scholars now believe the Romans extracted the easily found entries within decades, but the carefully coded entries, the ones with the Greek markers, the ones with the inner sanctum vessels, are still exactly where the Essene scribe placed them. The plates themselves now rest in the Jordan Museum in Amman. You can walk into that museum and see the 23 strips of copper that were cut at Manchester in 1956. You can see the carved Hebrew letter forms. You can see the embedded Greek clusters that nobody fully understands. You can stand in front of the only metal Dead Sea Scroll ever found and read for yourself the strange administrative code in which the priests of the Second Temple recorded the locations of their hidden gold. Subscribe to the Buried Testament. The treasures the priests hid before the city burned are being unearthed here, one entry at a time, one apocryphal text at a time. New chapter every Friday. And the story of the Copper Scroll does not end with the cutting either, because there is one specific entry in the inventory, entry 47 in the Walters numbering, that uses a phrase the Dutch scholar identified as describing the most sacred class of consecrated vessel known to the late Second Temple tradition. The phrase is technical priestly Hebrew. It refers to the items that were kept inside the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum, the chamber that contained, in the First Temple tradition, the Ark of the Covenant itself. What entry 47 of the Copper Scroll says about the location of that consecrated vessel, and how the Mount Nebo tradition from 2 Maccabees chapter 2 may map onto the Hebrew description of the specific structure named in that entry, is the subject of the next video on this channel. I am going to walk you through entry 47 of the Copper Scroll word by word to show you what the Hebrew actually says about the structure that contains the consecrated vessel of the inner sanctum, to show you the geographic candidates that have been proposed for the structure, and to show you the one specific reading of the entry that, when you align it with the Jeremiah tradition in 2 Maccabees, and with the topography of Mount Nebo as it stands today, sounds disturbingly close to a description of where the Ark of the Covenant of the original tabernacle has been hidden for the last 26 centuries. The cave was sealed for 1900 years. The plates were cut in 1956. The script has been partially deciphered. The next entry is waiting. The treasure is still buried.